David Hume's most famous contribution to ethics was his elucidation of the chasm that resides between the is and the ought. In a treatise on human nature, he writes, "I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it's necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it." For Hume, the world is comprised of statements of is, mere descriptions of reality, statements of fact. Moral statements, however, are dependent on normativity, which is to say the structure of the ought, which directs people and implores them to act in such and such a way, in such and such a situation. For Hume, there seems to be no clear way in which this chasm can be bridged without the introduction of an external principle. That is, ought is not easily derived from is. Normativity does not come from description. This is an absolutely foundational observation in modern ethics. And practically all ethical philosophies that followed it had to reckon in some way or another with this divide. When we discuss the moral questions entailed in the philosophy of religion, we are doing much the same. Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape is a particularly infamous attempt to address this issue. The take of many critics was that its central thesis, which is that science has the ability to establish objective morality, was insufficiently supported. Harris attempted to leap across Hume's divide by appeal to human well-being, claiming that this well-being could be derived from purely scientific fact. As of yet, the book's legacy remains fairly controversial, with most readers ultimately concluding that Harris didn't give a satisfactory answer the question he set out to address. This is a critique that seems to pose a problem for most atheisms. In some of the most well-intentioned of atheistic ethics, you'll result in something like a secular humanism, which seeks to ground morality on the basis of a principle of universal well-being for all humanity. But there are still issues here. First is a recognition that many scholars have made, from John Milbank to Tom Holland, that what we call Western humanism is really just the cultural residue of an inherently Christian attitude. An attitude that was in sharp distinction with, for example, the ethics of the Roman Empire, which didn't care at all, certainly not in comparison with Christianity, for the marginalized, the downtrodden, and all those who did not possess power or status within society. The egalitarian principles that tend to buttress secular humanism in their Western heritage are irreplaceably Christian. As such, this sort of humanism has a very particular religious foundation for its ethical attitude, and so cannot claim to have established that ethicality through purely atheistic means. It's not atheistic in origin or nature, so much as it is simply a derivative of religion, an ethical stance gutted of all metaphysical accoutrements. Hence the recent admission by Richard Dawkins, in spite of his famous atheism, align himself with Christianity culturally. The second and perhaps more philosophically important issue at play here is that even if somehow you were capable of establishing secular morality independent of any sort of religious influence, you'd struggle to establish them as applicable beyond simply statements of subjective preference, primarily because they fall short of what in these debates is usually framed in the terms of the objectivity inherent to religious attitudes to ethics. Without a good with a capital G, and I use this in a Platonic sense, independent of the assessment of human beings to serve as a rubric for ethical decisions, there seems to be little way to make ethics anything more than a set of private narratives for the individual or the culture, their own particular preference regarding how they think the world should play out. We should clarify that this is absolutely not the claim that atheists themselves cannot be moral or they are inherently immoral people. This is the worst possible formulation of the critique and the kind that you can only come up with if you don't actually have any atheist friends. It's rather the claim that atheism as a philosophical position seems to lack the ability to get off the ground, as it were, to move from this state of private preference to universal good. What atheism is unable to provide is a shared conviction that the good exists transcendent of one's own opinions and desires of it, but that also you can know that good, at least in an analogical sense. I should clarify why I say analogical. One of the ways in which this argument is formulated is as if it's a choice between two poles. On the one hand, we have atheists who, according to the religious critique, must be moral relativists. On the other hand, we have religion, which appeals to scripture and God. We should note that implicitly, this structure is oriented toward the conclusion of objectivism. That is, the condemnations of atheism seem to be on the basis of its failure to attain to the objectivity of ethical attitude that religion has. I believe this is accurate to a certain extent. Yes, I agree with the aforementioned critique and believe that the establishment of a universal good is what gives religion the upper hand in the moral sphere over and against atheism. However, it would be incorrect to suggest that this leads to what I'll call here an ethical objectivism, namely the claim that we can derive absolutely clear, universal, and ahistorical, that is not beholden to time or space, claims of ought from our objective good, even if we are religious. After all, the claim I hear from many apologists is that in being religious, you have access to ethical injunctions that are just true irrespective of time or space, without any sort of reference to historical conditions or particular interpretations. But these sort of claims are always subject to essentially deconstructive critiques in the vein of Jacques Derrida and the other postmodernists. All ideas have genealogies and histories which allowed their development and their flourishing. And the texts and traditions they're embedded in are subject to language, and so interpretation and hermeneutical bias and so on and so forth. That is, to be clear, although many people talk about objectivity in a positive sense, I don't think it's possible for anyone to actually grasp anything objective from within the framework of language and conceptuality that the human mind has available to it. That's not to say that somehow the objective good doesn't exist, which would be the position of atheism, and one that I think is ethically untenable. But rather that if this good is objective at all, that would mean it has to be transcendent of language and conceptuality, and therefore transcendent of all the particular ought statements that we might want to derive from it. The ought statements we derive from that good wouldn't be something that we could just believe objectively, as though we could unchain them from their historical conditions, and so have them simply apply universally for all situations, that is, in a deontological sense, in the way that Kant would have used his deontology. After all, if you're taking, for example, the Bible to be your source of objective morality, you'll have to reckon with the fact that a great deal of those instructions are clearly grounded in history. They very clearly seem to be addressed to and referring to the behaviours and attitudes of a particular civilization within a particular epoch of human history, with at best ambiguous hints that these principles might be applicable for later generations, and very little to suggest that these would be absolutely independent of time and space and all these other contingencies. In the Bible there are also myths and poetry and prophecy, and all these other things which make the idea of objective statements that are not subject to interpretation, all the more unlikely. Not to mention many apparent contradictions that you have to engage with and solve by way of hermeneutics, of interpretation. You have massacres and war crimes in the Old Testament and claims of loving your neighbour in the New. There has to be some kind of interpretive, if you want to use the word, subjective framework applied to the text in order to derive what is claimed to be an objective morality. There is always a certain degree of negotiation, of bias, to decide what to emphasize and what to diminish in importance when establishing your perfect objective morality. But then, at that point, it's self-defeating, because even if the text has an objective meaning, it is never something that you could have access to, because your interpretation of it already renders it somewhat, if not completely, subjective. I'll do a proper video on reading scripture in the future, but for now the point should stand. It's just very interesting to see how many people who agree on the sense of objective morality disagree within themselves about what actually constitutes that objectivity, which would seem like it would never be an issue if it was indeed objective. So that's what I want to clarify. Whether atheistic or religious, we shouldn't want to pretend that we can have perfectly unambiguous and objective ethical statements, ought statements that exist independent of their historical conditions. So, now that I've addressed both sides, I hope you see a middle way starting to be whittled into view. The usual debates around this topic tend to argue between moral relativism and moral objectivism, and then have no middle ground. I don't think this is an accurate way of approaching the topic. We can be gentler than a lot of debates between theists and atheists often tend to be, especially online. Ultimately, as I've suggested, the position I'd advance neither accepts ethical relativism, which I do believe that to a certain extent atheism is confined to, nor ethical objectivism, in the sense that there are an objective set of ought statements that tell us exactly how we should live. Rather, the distinction between those two positions is that the religious ethics lies not in the clinging to particular ought statements, but the positing of an objective good from which ought statements derive as it were, kind of symptoms or signs indicating that objective goodness. This it does in a way that atheism cannot, because atheism is at a loss to posit the existence of that universal objective good. But in positing this good, religious people do not need to somehow fail to pay heed to the reality that all ethical statements exist within and are conditioned by their particular historical occurrences and the interpretations that people have made of them throughout the course of their existence. The ethical source is not contained in ethical injunctions themselves. As I said earlier, the relationship between the two is an analogical one. So when we do something good for someone else, we have a sort of idea about what that goodness looks like, but it wouldn't be itself the objectivity of what makes it good. That objectivity is transcendent of the act itself. This is our middle way between objectivism and relativism, and it's here, I would argue, that we get what basically are Aristotelian virtue ethics. We can avoid particular deontological assertions in the vein of Kant, which can easily be disproven in most cases, while still not letting go of the idea that there are certain patterns to goodness that we can understand, at least analogically, that is, to a certain degree. And these patterns can become emboldened as we augment our intimacy to this objective good at the centre of all things, which, as religion claims, is indeed the ground and source of our very being. Thank you so much for watching. If you are new here, please do consider subscribing as this channel begins its growth, and if you are a subscriber, I'm more than happy to take video requests from you, as this video was indeed a video request. Also, do comment down below with your opinions on the topic in general or what I had to say on it. I love hearing from you, and especially hearing your critiques if you happen to disagree with me. Take care.